The sound of steel against stone echoes through the narrow corridors of the Blachernay Palace. As Emperor Constantine VII Dragozes crawls across the cold marble floor, his purple robes now stained crimson with his own blood. December 15, 969. Add, the most powerful man in the Eastern Roman Empire, heir to Caesar Augustus himself, reduced to a whimpering animal hiding in the shadows of his own throne room. His breathing comes in ragged gasps, each exhale creating small clouds in the winter air that seeps through the shattered windows. Outside, Constantinople burns. The orange glow of flames dances across the golden mosaics of Christ Pantocrator, creating the illusion that even the Lord himself weeps tears of fire for what the empire has become. Theodoros, he whispers, his voice barely audible above the distant screams of his dying city. Theodoros, where are you? But his most trusted advisor, his closest friend, the man who had promised to die before betraying him, is nowhere to be found. Because Theodoros is the one who opened the gates. Theodoros is the one who led the rebels through the secret passages. Theodoros is the one who drove the blade between Constantine's ribs just moments ago. The irony burns worse than the wound in his side. This man who had executed hundreds for treason, who had built his reign on the fear of betrayal, who had trusted no one except the one person who would ultimately destroy him. As his vision blurs and the sounds of his collapsing empire fade to whispers, Constantine VII Dragozes closes his eyes and remembers how it all began. In the perfumed halls of power where a young prince first learned that mercy was weakness and cruelty was strength. But to understand how the purple phoenix fell from the heavens, we must return to where it all started, in the golden cage of imperial succession, where a boy's soul was slowly poisoned by the very crown he was born to wear. The child who would become Constantine VII stood before a mirror of polished silver. In the imperial quarters, his reflection multiplied infinitely in the surrounding golden surfaces. At 7 years old, Mikhail Dragozes was already being groomed for absolute power. His every movement watched, his every word analyzed for signs of imperial potential. The morning sun streaming through the silk curtains caught the threads of gold woven into his miniature purple dalmatic, making him shimmer like a divine apparition. Stand straighter, commanded his tutor, Stephanos Lekapinos, a skeletal man, whose family had ruled before the Dragozes clan seized power. An emperor does not slouch. An emperor is the earthly representative of Christ himself. Would Christ slouch? The boy straightened his shoulders, but his dark eyes remained fixed on his own reflection, fascinated by the power it represented. Even at 7, there was something unsettling about his gaze, an intensity that made servants uncomfortable and courtiers nervous. Tell me about my enemies, young Mikhail said, his voice carrying an authority that seemed unnatural in one so small. Stephanos smiled, but it was the cold expression of a snake preparing to strike. This daily lesson had become a ritual, a catechism of paranoia and power that would shape the boy's understanding of the world. Your enemies are everywhere, young Caesar. They smile at you in the corridors. They bow when you pass. They speak words of loyalty while sharpening knives in the darkness. Your enemies include your cousins who also carry imperial blood, your generals who command armies, your senators who remember when their families held power, and your own servants who know your secrets. The boy nodded solemnly, absorbing each word like a sponge soaking up poison. What about my family? Your family are your greatest enemies of all, Stephanos whispered, leaning close enough that his breath touched the child's ear. Your uncle Basil plots to claim your throne. Your sister Maria dreams of marrying a usurper who will cast you down. Your own mother, the Augusta Theodora, keeps lists of your weaknesses to use against you when the time comes. This was the education of a future emperor, not mathematics or philosophy, but suspicion and fear. Not the wisdom of governance, but the art of survival through preemptive violence. By the time Mikhail reached his 10th birthday, he had already learned to see every kindness as manipulation, every friendship as potential betrayal, every advisor as a threat to be neutralized before they could strike. The transformation accelerated when his father, Emperor Romanos III, died suddenly in 949 AD. The official cause was fever, but everyone in the palace knew the truth. The purple-born prince had watched from the shadows as his mother, Theodora, fed her husband a cup of wine laced with mercury. The boy's face remained impassive as his father convulsed and died, foam streaming from his mouth onto the silk bedsheets. But something fundamental changed in young Mikhail that night. He learned that even the most sacred bonds could be severed for power, that even mothers could be murderers when the throne was at stake. At 12, he was crowned as Constantine VII. In the Hagia Sophia, the great dome echoing with chanted hymns as the crown of Constantine the Great was placed upon his head. The golden diadem was too large for his skull, sliding down over his eyebrows. But he refused the offer of adjustment. An emperor grows into his crown, he declared. He does not make the crown smaller. The early years of his reign were guided by his mother as regent, but Constantine was already maneuvering behind the scenes, building networks of loyalty through fear and reward. His first execution came at age 14, when he ordered the death of his uncle Basil on charges of treason. The evidence was fabricated, the trial a mere formality. But the message was clear. The boy emperor would not hesitate to kill his own blood. To protect his power, Uncle Basil's death was not clean or quick. Constantine ordered that he be blinded first, the traditional Byzantine punishment for imperial pretenders. Red-hot irons were pressed to the man's eyes while he screamed for mercy, calling out his nephew's name, begging for the love they had once shared. But young Constantine watched from his throne without expression, his small hands gripping the golden armrests as his uncle's sight was burned away forever. "Why did you not simply have him executed?" asked Theodoros Argyros, the young nobleman who had recently been appointed as the emperor's companion and advisor. Constantine turned to look at his new friend, and for a moment Theodoros saw something in those dark eyes that made him shiver. "Despite the warm palace air, because I wanted him to live in darkness, to spend every remaining day of his life remembering that his emperor could take away, not just his life, but his very ability to see the world. I wanted him to understand the price of disloyalty. It was the beginning of a friendship that would span decades and end in betrayal." But in those early days, Theodoros saw Constantine as a brilliant young ruler learning to navigate the treacherous waters of Byzantine politics. He did not yet understand that he was watching the birth of a monster. At 17, Constantine was forced into marriage with Helena Cantacuznos, daughter of a powerful noble family whose support was crucial for maintaining the dynasty's grip on power. The wedding was a spectacle of unimaginable grandeur, with silk hangings imported from China, pearls from the Indian Ocean, and gold worked into patterns so intricate they seemed to move in the candlelight dot. But behind the pageantry lay a cold, political calculation. Helena was beautiful, educated, and most importantly, her family commanded the loyalty of 3 elite military units. By marrying her, Constantine secured their allegiance while neutralizing a potential source of opposition. Helena herself was no naive bride. At 16, she had already survived 2 attempts on her life by rival noble families and understood that survival in the imperial court required intelligence, ruthlessness, and the ability to smile while planning someone's destruction. Their wedding night revealed the true nature of their relationship. As Helena undressed behind a silkscreen, her shadow dancing on the fabric, Constantine sat on the edge of their marriage bed and spoke his first words to her. "As husband and wife, you will bear me sons to secure the succession. You will attend court functions to maintain the appearance of harmony. You will never question my decisions in public or private. In return, you will live in luxury and your family will prosper. Betray me in any way, and I will have you strangled with a silk cord while you sleep." Helena's laughter rang out from behind the screen, clear and musical but with an edge of steel. "My lord husband speaks of betrayal on our wedding night. How romantic. Perhaps you should know that I have already arranged for your food to be tasted by my own servants, that my maids have instructions to test your gifts for poison, and that my family has sworn to avenge me should I die under suspicious circumstances." Constantine smiled for the first time that day, genuinely pleased by her response. "Good. I would hate to be married to a fool." Their union produced 3 children over the next 5 years, but it was a marriage of mutual suspicion disguised as imperial harmony. Helena bore him to sons, Mikhail and Andronikos, and a daughter, Anna. But each birth was accompanied by elaborate precautions against poisoning, accusations of infidelity, and tests of loyalty that grew more elaborate with each passing year. The children grew up in this atmosphere of beautiful paranoia, surrounded by luxury, but taught from infancy that everyone around them was a potential assassin. Young Mikhail learned to test his toys for hidden blades before playing with them. Andronikos was instructed never to eat food that had not been prepared by their personal cooks. Anna was taught to smile prettily while listening for information that might be used against her father's enemies. That it was during Anna's 3rd birthday celebration that Helena made her first and only serious attempt to overthrow her husband. The plan was ingenious in its simplicity. She would poison Constantine during the public feast, then claim the regency for their infant son while her family eliminated potential rivals. The poison was exotic, imported from India by merchants who owed her family debts, tasteless and nearly undetectable until it was too late. But Helena had underestimated her husband's paranoia. For 3 years, Constantine had been secretly testing small amounts of various poisons on condemned prisoners, building up immunity to the most common varieties while studying their effects. When Helena's poison entered his system, his body recognized and neutralized most of it, leaving him ill but alive. The emperor's response was swift and merciless. Helena was arrested during the feast itself, dragged from the high table while guests watched in horrified silence. Her co-conspirators were rounded up that same night, including 2 of her brothers and her eldest sister. But Constantine's revenge on his wife transcended simple execution. He ordered that she be kept alive, locked in a tower room where she could watch as her family members were tortured and killed one by one in the courtyard below. First, her brothers were flayed alive, their screams echoing off the palace walls as their skin was peeled away in strips. Then her sister was slowly strangled with a golden chain, her face turning purple as she gasped for air that would never come. Helena watched it all from her window, tears streaming down her face as she realized the true depths of her husband's cruelty. But the worst was yet to come. On the 7th day of her imprisonment, Constantine visited her cell personally, carrying their infant daughter Anna in his arms. "Your plot failed because you still believed in love," he told his wife, his voice gentle, almost tender. "You thought I would hesitate to hurt the mother of my children. You were wrong." He set Anna down on the stone floor and drew a small knife from his robes. Helena threw herself against the bars of her cell, begging, pleading, offering anything if he would spare their child. But Constantine's hand was steady as he made a shallow cut across the baby's palm, just deep enough to draw blood but not to cause lasting harm. "She will live," he said, wrapping Anna's hand in silk. "But this scar will remind her always that her mother chose treason over family. Every time she looks at her palm, she will remember that you valued power more than her life." Helena collapsed to her knees, broken not by her own suffering, but by the realization that she had failed to protect her children from the monster she had married. She lived for 3 more years in that tower, watching her daughter grow up below, learning to fear and distrust everyone around her, shaped by a father who saw paranoia as wisdom and cruelty as strength. When Helena finally died in 958, the official cause was melancholy, but everyone knew she had simply lost the will to live. Her body was found kneeling by the window, her face turned toward the courtyard where her family had died, her hands still reaching toward children she would never hold again. With Helena dead and her family eliminated, Constantine ruled alone, his children raised by tutors chosen for their loyalty rather than their wisdom. The emperor's court became a stage for elaborate displays of power, designed to intimidate both enemies and allies into absolute submission. One of his most infamous innovations was the weekly Feast of Truth, where courtiers were encouraged to share rumors, suspicions, and accusations against their fellow nobles. Those who provided useful information were rewarded with gold and advancement. Those who failed to participate were suspected of harboring secrets and subjected to investigation. Theodoros Argyros, now elevated to the position of domestic of the schools, and the emperor's closest advisor, had become an expert at navigating these treacherous waters. He had learned to provide just enough information to prove his loyalty, without destroying people unnecessarily, walking the fine line between usefulness and cruelty that survival in Constantine's court required. "You disapprove," Constantine observed one evening as they watched a minor noble being arrested based on accusations made during that night's feast. Theodoros chose his words carefully. "I serve your majesty's wisdom in all things. That's not what I asked." Constantine's voice carried the edge that courtiers had learned to fear. "I can see it in your eyes, Theodoros. You think I've gone too far." The two men stood on a balcony, overlooking the Bosphorus, the lights of Asia Minor twinkling across the dark water like fallen stars. They had been friends for over a decade, had shared secrets and victories, had trusted each other in ways that neither trusted anyone else. But in that moment, Theodoros understood that even their friendship existed at the emperor's pleasure. "I think," Theodoros said slowly, "that your majesty has created a system so perfect in its efficiency that it may eventually consume those who built it." Constantine laughed, but the sound was cold and brittle. "You're afraid that I'll turn on you eventually, that this wonderful machine I've built will grind up even my closest friend. The thought has occurred to me. Good. Fear will keep you loyal longer than love ever could." It was during this period that Constantine began his most ambitious project, the complete reformation of the imperial succession laws. Traditionally, the empire had been plagued by civil wars as various relatives fought for the throne. Constantine's solution was characteristically ruthless. He ordered the execution or exile of every person with even a distant claim to imperial blood, creating a law that would make any future challenge to his dynasty a crime punishable by death. For the claimant's entire family, the purge lasted 2 years and claimed over 300 lives. Cousins who had never spoken of politics were dragged from their estates and beheaded. Elderly women whose only crime was being born a Paleoalogos or Cantacuznos were found dead in their beds, officially victims of sudden illness but actually poisoned by imperial agents. Children as young as 5 were quietly smothered to prevent them from growing up to claim their birthright. Theodoros was tasked with overseeing much of this carnage, his administrative skills put to the service of systematic murder. He kept careful records of each death, each confiscated property, each family line snuffed out forever. At night, he would return to his own palace and wash his hands obsessively, trying to scrub away the metaphorical blood that stained his fingers. The breaking point came when Constantine ordered the death of Maria Paleologina, a 12-year-old girl whose grandfather had briefly held imperial power 30 years earlier. She was innocent of any political involvement, spent her days learning to embroider and play the harp, dreamed of becoming a nun rather than an empress. But her bloodline made her dangerous in Constantine's paranoid mind. Theodoros found himself standing in the girl's bedchamber, watching as she slept peacefully, her face relaxed in innocent dreams. In his hand was a vial of poison that would give her a gentle death, allowing her to slip away without pain or awareness. All he had to do was pour it into the cup of water beside her bed, and his duty would be complete. But as he stood there, watching her breathe, something inside him rebelled. This was not politics or strategy or even justice. This was simply murder. The killing of a child whose only crime was existing in a world where her blood made her inconvenient. He poured the poison into a flower pot instead and reported to the emperor that the deed was done, producing a forged death certificate from a bribed physician. It was his first act of betrayal, small and secret, but it marked the beginning of a transformation that would eventually lead to Constantine's downfall. By 966, Constantine VII ruled an empire built on terror and maintained through systematic brutality. His children had grown into products of their environment. Mikhail, now 21, was already showing signs of his father's paranoid tendencies, seeing enemies in every shadow and potential in every friendship. Andronikos, at 19, had developed a taste for elaborate cruelties that exceeded even his father's innovations. Anna, 17, and bearing the scar on her palm that reminded her daily of her mother's fate, had learned to navigate the court through manipulation and strategic seduction. The empire itself was prosperous on the surface, but rotting from within. Trade flourished because merchants feared the consequences of failure. Taxes were collected efficiently because collectors knew that shortfalls meant death. The army remained loyal because soldiers understood that betrayal meant not just their own execution but the massacre of their families. But the system of governance through terror contained the seeds of its own destruction. Fear could ensure compliance, but it could not inspire genuine loyalty. It could prevent open rebellion, but it could not stop the quiet conversations that took place in shadowed corners, the whispered plans that grew in the darkness between absolute obedience and desperate resistance. Theodorus had spent 3 years building a secret network of discontent, carefully identifying nobles, merchants, and military officers who had grown tired of living in constant fear. His approach was subtle, never directly advocating rebellion, but simply listening to complaints, offering sympathy, and gradually connecting like-minded individuals who had previously felt isolated in their opposition. The catalyst came in early 969, when Constantine ordered the execution of Bishop Methodios, the most respected religious figure in the empire. The bishop's crime was delivering a sermon that criticized the moral state of the imperial court, without specifically mentioning the emperor by name. But in Constantine's paranoid interpretation, any criticism of court morality was an attack on his personal character, and therefore an act of treason. The execution was public and designed to send a message about the consequences of challenging imperial authority even indirectly. Bishop Methodios was not granted the quick death of beheading or the merciful release of poison. Instead, he was slowly roasted alive over a fire in the hippodrome while thousands of citizens watched in horrified silence. As the bishop's screams echoed through the ancient stadium, something fundamental shifted in the collective consciousness of Constantinople. This was not the execution of a political rival or the elimination of a potential usurper. This was the murder of a holy man whose only sin was speaking truth to power. And it demonstrated that no one, no matter how innocent or respected, was safe from the emperor's wrath. Theodorus watched from the imperial box as his friend and emperor smiled with satisfaction at the sounds of suffering below. In that moment, he made the final decision that would determine both their fates. Constantine VII had to die, not for political gain or personal revenge, but because he had become a cancer that was killing the empire from within. The conspiracy that followed was a masterpiece of careful planning and patient execution. Over the course of 8 months, Theodorus assembled a network of 43 conspirators, including key military commanders, influential senators, wealthy merchants, and even members of the imperial household staff. Each was carefully vetted, their motivations tested, their reliability confirmed through small acts of trusted cooperation. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. During the Feast of Epiphany on January 6, 970, when Constantine would be participating in the traditional blessing of the waters ceremony, Theodorus would lead the emperor into a private room in the palace to discuss urgent military business from the eastern frontier. There, hidden conspirators would overpower the imperial guards and eliminate Constantine quickly and quietly while the rest of the court remained focused on the religious ceremony. But the conspiracy required one final element to ensure success: the support of Constantine's own son, Mikhail. Without a clear succession plan, the emperor's death would likely trigger a civil war as various factions fought for control. If Mikhail could be convinced to support the rebellion, he could be placed on the throne as a puppet ruler while the conspirators implemented reforms that would restore sanity to the imperial government. Approaching the emperor's son required delicate maneuvering and careful psychological manipulation. Mikhail had been shaped by the same paranoid environment that had created his father, but he also possessed a young man's natural desire for independence and authority. Theodorus spent weeks building trust, sharing military secrets and court gossip, gradually positioning himself as a mentor and ally rather than his father's agent. The crucial conversation took place in November 969, just 2 months before the planned assassination. Theodorus and Mikhail were reviewing tax receipts from the Anatolian provinces. When the older man made his move, "Your father is a great emperor," Theodorus said carefully. But greatness in one generation can become tyranny in the next if not properly guided. Mikhail looked up from the documents, his dark eyes so like his father's studying Theodoros with sudden intensity. That sounds very much like treason. It sounds like concern for the future of the empire. Your father has eliminated his enemies, so effectively that he has begun to see enemies where none exist. How long before that paranoia extends to his own family? The question hung in the air between them like a drawn blade. Both men understood that they had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Either Mikhail would report this conversation to his father, resulting in Theodoros' immediate execution, or he would become part of the conspiracy against the man who had raised him to rule. What are you suggesting? Mikhail asked finally. I'm suggesting that a wise prince prepares for the inevitable transition of power, and that transition might be accelerated if it serves the greater good of the empire. Mikhail's agreement came not from love of justice or concern for the empire's welfare, but from cold political calculation. He had watched his father rule through terror for over a decade and understood that such methods, while effective in the short term, created unstable foundations for long-term power. More importantly, he recognized that participating in his father's downfall would place him in debt to the conspirators, giving him powerful allies while demonstrating his own ruthless pragmatism to potential enemies. With Mikhail's tacit support secured, the final preparations began. Weapons were smuggled into the palace piece by piece. Guard rotations were studied and memorized. Escape routes were mapped and tested. The conspirators practiced their roles until each man could perform his part without conscious thought. But as the fateful day approached, Theodoros found himself struggling with unexpected doubts. Despite everything Constantine had become, despite the terrible things he had done, they had once been genuine friends. They had shared jokes and secrets, had trusted each other in ways that neither had trusted anyone else. The man he was planning to kill was a monster, but he was a monster who had shown him kindness and respect when no one else would. The Feast of Epiphany celebration proceeded exactly as planned. The palace was filled with nobles and church officials, their attention focused on the elaborate religious ceremony taking place in the palace chapel. Constantine himself seemed relaxed and happy, enjoying the pageantry and the obvious deference of his subjects. As the evening progressed, Theodoros approached the emperor during a break in the proceedings. Majesty, urgent news from the Danube frontier. General Skleros reports movement by the Bulgarians that may require immediate response. Constantine nodded, unsurprised by the interruption. Military crises were a constant feature of imperial life, and he trusted Theodoros to handle such matters efficiently. Show me the dispatches. They made their way through the marble corridors toward the emperor's private study, their footsteps echoing in the relative quiet away from the celebration. Constantine walked slightly ahead, his purple robes rustling against the polished floor, completely unaware that he was being led to his death by the one person he trusted above all others. The ambush happened in the antechamber to the study, exactly as planned. As Constantine reached for the door handle, 3 conspirators emerged from their hiding places behind silk hangings. But something went wrong immediately. The emperor's reflexes, honed by decades of paranoid vigilance, saved his life in the first crucial seconds. He spun around at the sound of approaching footsteps, his hand automatically reaching for the ceremonial dagger at his belt. The first attacker's blade, aimed at his heart, instead caught him in the shoulder, spinning him against the wall but failing to deliver a fatal wound. Theodoros, Constantine shouted, his voice echoing with betrayal and rage. Help me! But Theodoros stood frozen in the doorway, his own dagger in his hand, unable to move forward or retreat. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the 2 friends stared at each other across the bloody chaos of the antechamber. And Constantine finally understood the truth. The emperor's expression shifted from surprise to pain to cold, terrible understanding. My friend, he whispered. And in those 2 words was a lifetime of shared trust now shattered beyond repair. It was that expression of betrayed friendship that finally broke Theodoros' paralysis. With a cry that was part rage and part anguish, he lunged forward and drove his blade between Constantine's ribs. feeling it scrape against bone as it penetrated deep into his friend's chest. Constantine gasped, blood bubbling from his lips as he collapsed against the marble wall. But even as he died, his eyes remained fixed on Theodore's face, searching for some explanation that would make sense of this ultimate betrayal. Why? He managed to whisper. Theodore's knelt beside the man he had just murdered, tears streaming down his face as he watched the life fade from those dark eyes that had once looked at him with genuine affection. Because you forgot how to trust anyone except me, and that made you too dangerous to live. Constantine VII Dragozes died as he had lived, surrounded by violence and betrayal. His final words lost in the bubbling of blood in his throat. The man who had trusted no one had been killed by the one person he had allowed himself to trust. The emperor who had built his power on fear and suspicion had been destroyed by the very qualities that had sustained his reign. As news of the assassination spread through the palace, the carefully planned succession proceeded smoothly. Mikhail was proclaimed emperor within hours, supported by the military commanders who had been part of the conspiracy. The new emperor, Mikhail VII, promised reforms and reconciliation, vowing to rule with justice rather than terror. But the damage done by his father's reign could not be undone overnight. The empire Constantine had ruled was strong but brittle, prosperous but spiritually exhausted, feared by its enemies but unloved by its subjects. His children had been shaped by paranoia and cruelty. His nobles had learned to value survival over honor, and his people had forgotten what it meant to trust their government. Theodore's Argyros received honors and wealth from the grateful new emperor, but found no peace in his reward. He had saved the empire from a tyrant, but he had also murdered his closest friend. He had prevented further atrocities, but he had become an assassin himself. He spent his remaining years in charitable works, trying to atone for his betrayal. But he never escaped the memory of Constantine's final question: why? The legacy of Constantine VII endured long after his death. His methods of governance through systematic terror became a template for future tyrants, while his downfall served as a warning about the ultimate futility of ruling through fear alone. He had been a man capable of genuine friendship and even love, but power had corrupted those better qualities until only suspicion and cruelty remained. In the end, the emperor who had trusted no one was betrayed by the one person he had allowed himself to trust. The ruler who had built his throne on the bones of his enemies was brought down by the friend who had helped him build it. And the man who had believed that fear could replace loyalty learned too late that terror, no matter how perfectly implemented, could never create the bonds of genuine affection that might have saved his life. The golden throne that had gleamed with such terrible beauty in the light of burning cities and dying enemies now sat empty, waiting for another occupant who would face the same choices between power and humanity, the same temptations that had transformed a young prince into a monster, and the same ultimate reckoning that comes to all who forget that even emperors are mortal men whose crowns cannot protect them from the consequences of their own choices.